Good morning, all, and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion. Normally, I start the webinar with loads of facts and figures that sort of match the topic that we'll be discussing today. But today's topic is the REC report on jobs decoded and what the last year's data is going to tell us. Our special guest is obviously Neil Carberry, the head of the REC, and he'll be giving out all the relevant facts and figures about the industry and just what the second half of the year potentially may look like for the industry. Neil, thank you for joining us today. Once again, it's much appreciated. Myself and the rest of the Jump team who are also here today look forward to hearing your comments, and no doubt we'll be jumping in with some questions and comments throughout their own. So however, it's you, the audience, that sort of Neil wants to help and hear from. So feel free to ask any questions, put them in the chat box and work from there. So Neil, why don't we kick off? As you said, you want to sort of give us a view of the marketplace and what's looking on the marketplace.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for the invite this morning to the Jump team, and good to be on with everybody. Howard, could you just pop the first of the data slides up, and we'll work from there. I thought I'd do a little bit of a dive into our data, and then just to roll the pitch a little bit for the discussion we're going to have. By the way, the growth data for the UK economy this morning was actually quite good.
Yeah, it was lovely news, wasn't it?
I'm going to rain on your parade. Most of it was GPs seeing patients in person again, which generates a different flow of money through the health budget and has bounced back. But services went backwards. Manufacturing was okay, but what's clear is that the GDP picture is low and slow. I'm not sure that I'd go as far as there'll definitely be a technical recession in the second half of the year, but the economy has slowed. What we've seen is a big bounce back in demand from employers, and we'll go and talk about that in a second, but a much slower bounce back in supply. So you see on this graph that unemployment's basically back to where it was before the pandemic. What's important to remember about unemployment is it is only people who are not in work who have not looked for a job in the last 28 days. So if you haven't looked for a job, you are not unemployed, you are inactive. And what's really important here is that we've had a massive spike in inactivity. Now, that could be related to all sorts of things: long COVID, caring responsibilities, people taking early retirement, people doing changes. But we think there's about 600,000 to 1 million fewer people in the UK labour market now than there would have been if COVID hadn't happened. Now, some of that might be about Brexit as well. We do think that COVID caused more people with settled status to move away from the UK, not necessarily back to their country of origin, but to an EU member state than maybe we're expecting. We're seeing really tight supply in sectors like food in Northern Ireland and in the southwest and places like that. But the bulk of it is just the challenge that we have with activity levels amongst the UK domestic workforce. Some of that's young people staying in college. Fine, they'll feed into the labour market the next couple of years. Very logical for young people to stay in college in a period like the last couple of years. Lots of it is older workers, and it's kind of difficult to understand at the moment whether they're ill or they are caring for someone. 100,000 kids aren't back in school. Somebody's looking after them. And in most families, I suspect that's more likely to be grandparents than parents. And then there's the lifestyle changes. So there's there's a real pressure on supply in the UK that is what's leading to this level of unrequited demand that we're seeing. And many of you will have seen it taking longer to fill vacancies. If we skip the slide on one.
Yeah, so a computer will work for me. There we go.
So this is basically our survey of clients of hiring companies. Now, the first thing to say is clients are always more confident about their own business than they are about the UK economy. Now that could be biased. Actually, I think it's quite reasonable because people believe what they read in the press about the economy, and that's often quite sort of black and white, whereas they're looking at data that they know and understand for their own firm. The most important thing here is that we've had a period of robust belief in investing and hiring in my own firm from clients over the last year to 18 months, and that has now turned negative. So remember, when we report balances, a positive balance is just more clients saying they're more confident. A negative balance is more clients saying they're less confident. We tipped negative in the last set of data that we did with clients. That is a sign that there are concerns starting to play out. And if you try and get into your clients' heads right now, well, we can't keep competing on higher salaries for new staff and not do something for our own people. Our energy costs are uncapped and they're going up. We're paying more tax in terms of NI and ultimately corporation tax, although we wait to see what the merry-go-round of taxation promises that is the Conservative leadership contest brings us. But there are lots of cost pressures linked to then the wider inflation piece, where I think clients are starting just to gently take the foot off the pedal. And we're seeing that in the growth figures as well. We take that into report on jobs, which of course is our billings data. We're definitely seeing that the market is still improving, and report on jobs tends to lag jobs outlook by a couple of months, but it's now improving at, in this case, 60-month low for permanent recruitment, similar sort of thing in temp. Longer times to fill, but because of that tightness in the labour market that we talked about earlier, starting salaries still rising strongly, staff availability not as bad as it was a couple of months ago, but members still struggling to find people. So there's a whole piece here about a very tight labour market, but also clients starting to feel the pressure, particularly of inflation and of low growth, and of some of the barriers to international trade. I don't just mean Brexit when I say that. I also mean supply chain. We're trying to move the REC at the moment. And the thing I've learned is that 80% of the timber that's used in UK office fit outs comes from the Ukraine or Russia, which is, of course, something of a challenge if you're trying to fit out a new office this year. So if we move slide on one. So we definitely see the moderation of the market a little bit over the last few months in jobs postings. So we're 1.7 million active jobs postings in the week of 6th to 12th of June, but new jobs postings have fallen, have stabilized and fallen a little bit over the last few weeks. So the fact that there are as many active postings there is really a sign that vacancies are taking longer to fill. What's interesting is the stabilization. Even now, new postings are what we'd regard as a relatively healthy level for any normal year. So I remember sort of 9 months ago talking to Tony Danker, the DG of the CBI, and talking about the 9 months we've just had as a bit of a sugar rush in our labour market. And the thing about sugar rush is the big question is, how do you come down? And my view is the big thing for the industry to get our heads around right now is it will not be like this for very much longer. The question is it soft landing or hard landing? Do you have your strategies in place to deal with each of those? It does seem to me that this is a very odd slowdown because the market is so tight for candidates that actually employment might not be as badly affected as we would normally think. But I'll finish on my one kind of takeaway that I put into the speech at the REC conference a couple of weeks ago, although I have recovered my good looks from the two black eyes then. I think we've seen half of the economic change that the pandemic will wreak. So the next couple of years, hopefully things will settle in all sorts of ways, but I think clients will be changing their business repeatedly and in pretty fundamental ways. So getting close to that, whether it's a hard landing or a soft landing, is going to be a big strategy for recruiters. There we go, Howard. Quick run through of kind of what I reckon. Interested in having a chat about all of this.
There's loads of data there that we could start to pick apart, Neil. I mean, it's really interesting when you start to sort of break it down into those levels: hard landing, soft landing. What's it going to be like when we come down from that sugar rush? And we know the provide massive value of information via the job reports. So if we looked at that data and said, let's look at the specific last 6 months, what's that told us about the market recovery? And as your question there, or your comments there about hard landing, soft landing, where do you see that going? You know, we've had this incredible 6 months. Everyone's saying, you know, best month, best quarter, best year, etc. You know, what's the data telling you that is actually happening now in the marketplace?
So I draw a couple of things out. One is when you look at sectors, the gap between sectors is what you'd expect it to be. So all the sectors that were in high demand before the sugar rush are the ones that were having the toughest time in filling vacancies now. So you're thinking hospitality, you're thinking health, you're thinking IT, you're thinking engineering, you're thinking logistics. And for instance, retail is up, but it's not up anything like as much. And I think we can expect that structure to move up and down with the economy. So, you know, classic example, in 2020, we didn't really have a recession in IT recruitment. You know, there was a bit of a freeze, and then everything picked up again very, very quickly. I think the other thing that I'd point to is very significant in this is when you look at the report on jobs or any of these balance surveys, remember that the question is a simple Roman Emperor question: is it up or is it down? So if you look at something like pay, expectation management's really important, because yes, pay is rampant in some of those sectors, you know, double-digit rates in some areas, but not everywhere. It's up everywhere. So I think one of the things to think about is, you know, in my sector, what's really happening on pay, and how can I help candidates to understand the labour market they're playing in? Because the truth is, when people see average earnings running at 9%, well, firstly, settlements for existing staff are still running at 3% to 4%, probably north of 4% over the next few months. And secondly, that's an average that hides a massive distribution. So all of those things, again, doubling down to your niche, understanding what's really happening on pay in your niche, and where your niche sits in that demand curve, are going to be really important to understanding the right ways to advise clients, and also how you prepare candidates for the negotiations that they're going to have on the perm side.
So it's interesting when we start to look at that, before we start to go into more of that sort of session, I think the big question that's sort of burning everyone's lips at the moment is this, you know, the impact on the market. What do you think the resignation of Boris Johnson will have as an impact on the marketplace? Because obviously it's going to be on everyone's lips at the moment, so it'd be just childish not to ask the question.
So here's my kind of apolitical. Here's my apolitical view, although I have to note that one of the moments of my week was when Alex Sherbrooke stood up and opposed the allowing agency workers to replace striking workers from the Tory benches on Monday night.
It was a beautiful moment, wasn't it?
allowed me the position I wanted, which is MPs from all parties have spoken against this, because you never want to be solely on one side or the other. And look, I think business likes stability, right? And in the short term, clearly, a transition period is a challenge. But ask yourself whether we have really had an economic narrative that businesses can invest against for the last couple of years. I think Levelling Up, actually, and Global Britain are really good headings for an economic narrative. But the Levelling Up Green Paper was published in March, and basically nothing happened after that. So there's a real sense of it should be good for the market if what happens next is a government that adopts a clear and realistic economic plan that accepts that governments can't do everything, and which then gives companies a sense of where investment will be worthwhile. And I think that could be true of either party, because I think on the one hand, you've got the Tories who are in the midst of a leadership election. On the other hand, Labour are getting to the point where they're going to have to start articulating what the plan is sometime soon, especially when you're 10 points ahead in the polls. People look at you a bit more seriously then. I think on both sides, what we're trying to do is get them into the right place on that. So we've got a big new report coming out on Monday next week around what happens if you don't sort skills and labour shortages out in the UK. And, you know, just pulling the curtain back on that, it's basically the equivalent of burning the entire defence budget every year. So there are reasons to encourage businesses and government to be thinking about this stuff. Yeah, it's a real politician's answer, Howard, but I think it's too early to tell. It rather depends on what's the position taken by the new Prime Minister, and how far does it acknowledge the kind of economic realities that the country faces?
I think we've got two sides, haven't we? We've got 7 of the 8 all promising huge tax cuts. One saying that's a bit of a dream world, but he is promising tax cuts as and when they should be applied to the market. So if we took both those sort of juxtapositions, you know, where would you see yourself, you know, if we looked from the smart money and say if one side gets in or the other side gets in, what would that do to the economy with regards to tax cuts? Is that going to improve it, or do we think that is foolish, as Sinak is saying, or do we think if Sinak gets in, it's going to be a little bit more of a harder landing than a softer landing?
So Margaret Thatcher wouldn't cut taxes in this environment. So let's lance that now. You know, as a kind of what a monetarist economist would say, this is not the moment. And if you think about the political environment, in terms of the NHS crisis, it's going to be very, very difficult for a PM to launch a massive tax cutting agenda. The core of it is that only growth can lift your tax revenues and protect your public spending, and that's why a growth strategy really, really matters. I do think that doesn't preclude a government doing different things with the tax base. And, you know, we were very noisy about the NI increase. And to be honest, I probably, you know, where I improbably dropped into the seat of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I probably would go back on that and look for the revenue elsewhere. And the reason for that is that what we've had in business taxation, and remember 60% of the NI rate is paid by businesses, not by individuals. What we've seen is a move of taxes away from profits and towards activity. So if you've got so for instance, in a restaurant, you know, the government's put your labor costs up 1% this year, before you've even dealt with the fact that you've got a massive shortage and you've got massive pay pressure coming from the labour side anyway. Creating some headroom there might be useful for activity and help some businesses through. We'll see how it plays out, but I think it's really important that whoever wins takes a twofold step, which is, one, what can we afford to do, and two, which, if we want to adjust taxes, which taxes have the biggest economic bang.
So let's park the political side, because we don't like to get political on our webinars. Let's move back into the business. So everyone sort of linking the economy has mentioned the R word, recession, you know, with only one of the candidates up for election talking about tax cuts. You know, how do you then see the market performing irrespective? You know, looking at the data that you have, how do you see the market performing in the next 6 months of the year? What do you see as being the big movers and shakers?
So I think the biggest single question is, what is the ongoing impact of inflation on clients' businesses? And if inflation washes through, so most of the inflation we're seeing at the moment is driven by international factors. It's driven by a bit of currency devaluation. It's driven by a high oil price, although the oil price has come off quite significantly in the last few days. And it's driven by materials prices going through the roof on almost everything. If that washes through quickly, and I'm a bit of an optimist on that, then I think we've got a reasonable potential, given the demographic position of the labour market in terms of supply, that actually for what we will see is a gentle slowdown to probably what we call a toughish autumn and early 23, but not out of the kind of the normal course of things, where the business, where I think if you get your business planning right and your client relationships right, things should be okay, rather than the alternative, which is inflation stays high, wage costs continue to rise, and then we have a bit more of a deep recession. For me, I think what's really interesting about this period for recruiters is we're off the kind of everyone's in the same storm cycle now. So in 2020, first half of 2020 was crap for all of us. And then there was a recovery came through in tail end of 2020 through 21 into early 22, which was pretty much in different stages great for most recruiters. We're now in a position where I think things will differentiate again. And one of the things that's really important goes to a lot of the content at the CBI workforce conference that we're supporting them putting together soon. A lot of our content, our conference back on the 30th, which is all available, will all be available online for REC members soon. A lot of the work we're doing, with your good selves, but also with Greg Savage in August, which is just, this is the time to really be embedding some of the fundamentals of being the boat that floats in this moment. And I think that comes down to understanding where your clients are. It comes down to deep long-term relationships with your clients that are really about what the business plan is, and therefore how you pivot to support that, and a bit of lively thinking and kind of maybe a bit fleet on the foot stuff about just watching where the opportunities are. And I think for recruiters, this is a business where we're watching what's happening hour to hour and day to day and week to week. I think as recruitment business leaders, just carving out a bit of time to think about where we are and what needs to happen next every week is going to be really important. Because the truth is, and this is the line I use in a lot of speeches at the moment, and I don't apologize for repeating it, anyone who tells you they know what the British labour market will be like this time next year is either a charlatan or a liar. Because I've been watching the British labour market for 20 years and I do not know. I know there's a slowdown coming. I don't know if it's a hard landing or a soft landing. And I don't know how long it persists for because we don't know about inflation. That just puts a massive premium on having clarity of strategy, having really deep client relationships that are much more, your former boss said at our conference, Heather, Tim Cook, he said, you don't shudder before you write the check for your mates. And what he meant was if you have that deep valued relationship, you're less cuttable.
Yes, exactly
in tough times. So I think all of that stuff and just making space for it, even though it can feel counterintuitive, where if maybe the numbers aren't quite where they need to be in any given week, is super important.
Yeah. So if we looked at that, then you sort of said right at the beginning that, and I completely agree, because quite a lot of my clients are in that IT sector. IT didn't have a recession in 2020, 21, etc. And if you look at the information that the REC gathers, including your jobs reports, which areas of recruitment do you see continued growth in, and potentially which areas do you see a slowdown in?
So anything that's in the blue collar early paid market, and I think broadly in the early paid market, so think about hospitality, I just think you've seen what's happened at airports. You're seeing the kind of changes to hours that restaurants are having to make to stay open. I think there's a lot of capacity there that, while a slowdown will likely stop people eating out quite as much, that's not a bad thing necessarily for a sector that can't meet demand as it is. And then anything high skill, where particularly new skills that the production method is not quite in place for yet. So anything green, and anything about cybersecurity, lots of the kind of software side of IT, that stuff hugely in demand. And then health and social care in an enormous way, and particularly driven by the fact that we had a shortage anyway, but we've now got a situation where a lot of the workforce in health and social care are saying, no, actually, I don't want to work like this anymore. And even if I do, I'm knackered after the last 2 years, and I might want to come out of the sector and then go back in, and that's creating huge challenges.
And sort of butt in with the jumper opinion, Howard, forgive me, but it's not a coincidence, is it, Neil, that those sectors are the ones where we've got biggest candidate shortages, which means there's a bigger market for recruitment and it's less impacted by economic cycles because we've got such a significant candidate shortage. And, you know, there seems to be a mirror going on between those two factors.
Underpinned by Brexit. The whole, you know, these sectors have all been impacted very heavily by the Brexit situation.
I think we're going to come on and talk about.
And there's a mindset challenge here, Paul and Heather, which was really well summed up in a discussion I had with Neil Morrison, the HRD of Severn-Trent, a couple of weeks back. And unfortunately, Neil couldn't make our conference on the 30th. But his message to the industry was, stop telling me it's difficult. That's why I pay you. And I think there is a bit of framing here for us, which is a candidate type market is actually an opportunity rich market for us.
Absolutely.
If we believe in our product. And, you know, I'm going to hypothesize that we all do. So there's something there about how we frame these things for clients.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's important, how we frame them, because we've talked about this an awful lot, about how you frame with clients, and, you know, just taking a job and telling your client that you can fill the job when you know full well that there aren't people on the market. You know, you're framing the client in the mindset that you can be his cure when you're not going to be his cure, and that sort of just castigates the same thing from a recruitment point of view, that we're all the same. Where if you're open and honest, I've got 3 or 4 clients who are now being blunt with clients and saying, we're never going to find these people, especially at this and this levels, etc. And it's absolutely imperative that we be really open and honest with the clients. And Paul, you just mentioned Brexit then, you know, that's now becoming more and more apparent. So if we looked at that and flipped Brexit into the quick question, how do you see that affecting the marketplace? Because some of the areas that you said, as in hospitality, you know, care home, the NHS, etc., were massively subsidised by foreign workers coming into the UK. So how do you see Brexit affecting us over the next 12 months?
So there are kind of headline challenges in the tradable sectors. You know, it is just more difficult to do manufacturing supply chain stuff that crosses the channel now. But actually, I think we find workarounds for that in pretty reasonable ways. Clearly, the tinderbox of this is on the next island over, and one of the big challenges for any British government is finding a way through that, because the last thing we want is trade war, and that, I think, you know, all bets are off then. But from a purely labour market point of view, I think the most important thing is sort of the collective amnesia that countries tend to adopt when they've had a traumatic experience, as in, let's stop talking about Brexit and start talking about a sensible immigration policy to support our economy, which probably means, you know, above the salary bar, actually, the new immigration system's pretty good. You know, at the high skill level, it kind of works. Our problem is that below the salary bar, there's nothing. So we need to start having discussions about, well, youth mobility schemes, partnership schemes with other countries. If the government is set on not having a European preference, and I think they are, what are the vehicles that we can use that bring people into the country sustainably to work in these sectors and give them a good experience as well as us? And the model here really has been well set by the agricultural workers scheme, which is another one which has had to pivot really quickly this year, because unfortunately our agricultural sector thought they'd sorted themselves out on workers for this year's harvest back in January and February, because they were all coming from Ukraine. And strangely, the lads in Ukraine feel that they've got something else on their hands at the moment. So what's happened actually is that the search is pivoted into Central Asia, into Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and more of our workforce for agriculture will come from there these years. But that's this year. There's a really kind of clear system there, and the Home Office trusts that people come in, they do the work, we work to make sure they're well treated, they go home, and the wages they earn here by a lot back home. I think we need a similar sort of thing more broadly in the labour market, which I think is probably reviewing the shortage occupation list more regularly. So it's a properly market-driven tool rather than just what a bunch of people sitting in a room at the Home Office decide. And it's about kind of mobility schemes that we can use to pull people through. The critical thing is going to be getting past the B word. And as much as, you know, we all feel strongly one way or the other on this, the more it feels like you're relitigating Brexit in discussing policy with government on immigration, the more it's the less successful we're like to be. But I also want to emphasize that Brexit is a small bit of this. The biggest single challenge is domestic demographics, which is the domestic workforce is getting smaller. And you know, you've all heard my favorite stat before, but I'm never going to stop using it, which is 50% more babies born in 1964 than 1977.
Yeah,
that has an effect on the labour market.
Yeah.
It's interesting when you sort of look at it like that, that has a huge effect on the labour market and how the labour market is deemed. And if you look at, say, our labour market, you know, daily we see recruitment companies struggling to recruit staff for themselves. I mean, last time you were on our webinar, you stated that company owners shouldn't not automatically jump on the bandwagon of paying higher salaries to get less skilled workers in. So has the REC got information on what effect the lack of talent had on the recruitment industries? And have you seen salaries significantly increase with the rate of inflation in our own industry?
So the biggest challenge I've seen to the industry is people being bought out of it into internal roles at rates of pay which kind of cause your eyes to pop out of your head. And to be honest, my view is that's probably unsustainable. When we were together before, my kind of sense was that we needed just to have a check on, you know, what the reality is. So earlier in the year, we published some benchmarking data, which is on the REC website, around what the actual rates of pay are for different roles in the industry. Like all sectors, people who move jobs are pulling in substantial rises. I think there is a sense that when the market cools, some of those commitments might look like overstretch. And that's, I have been of the view for most of the year, and I remain of the view that it's about picking the work you want to do. So it's the stuff that is repeatable and sustainable through a downturn. And you know what? Sometimes it's the sensible business decision to leave some turnover on the shelf because it won't fall to the bottom line.
It's interesting, that, isn't it? Because we have this conversation quite a lot with clients, and we start to look at, you know, their gross profit and how much gross profit drops back down to their net profit line. And the first line you look at is, you know, what's their turnover to gross profit, to look at what their margin, you know, actually looks like, and how many clients actually have what we would class as a vanity client, where they're making very little money out, but the amount of work and amount of process that goes into there is absolutely huge. And it's interesting that you're saying the same thing, that sometimes those vanity clients, you know, aren't really worth the work they're doing, and therefore leaving that, you know, gross profit on the shelf is absolutely really an interesting one. If we then looked at that from a recruitment point of view, you know, one of the questions we also get asked is, you know, the difference between recruiting recruiters into your business and recruiting people who are non-recruitment and train and development. You know, have you seen a massive shift in how people are, you know, what type of people bringing into the business? Because obviously that then has a direct effect on the cost of the business, because obviously a recruiter, you spend less money on developing that person compared to somebody who's got no recruitment experience.
I've definitely seen a move back to entry-level hiring. And that, I think that sits along, I think every business now should be thinking about, what am I buying, which is going to cost me more, skilled people? What am I borrowing? Stuff that I don't need permanently and that I can bring in in different ways, term contracts, agency, so forth, and what am I growing, with more of an emphasis towards the grow. And actually with clients, you want to get into that space of discussing those three with them, and that honest thing about, well, I can help you with these things, and that you need to talk to someone else about. I think we apply that to ourselves. To my mind, I think the market for skilled recruiters had a couple of kind of engines of its overheat. One was clearly we had a horrific first half of 2020 and lots of people exited the profession, so that reduced the stock. But we also compounded that for very reasonable reasons by reducing the flow, which is when you're working entirely remote in the midst of a lockdown, it's not the best time to bring new people into the business. So we have a kind of gap in our workforce of 2-year recruiters right now, people who might have been hired in the first part of 2020, who in normal times would have a couple of years of experience now, and there just aren't as many of them because we weren't doing a lot of hiring then. I think the sensible firms sort of took the advice that I know James Reed, amongst others, was doling out in September and October of 2020, which is if you're going to want to hire experienced people, go and do it now. I think the ship sailed for large-scale hiring of experienced staff quite a while ago. So I'd strongly be advising people to look at how you build your own team now, because the market is tight. And as it comes off and things settle again, then I think it'll liven up.
I think that goes to your point, Neil. That also goes to the fact that retention then of our own people becomes a huge issue, particularly if, as you said earlier, so many are going to work for clients.
Well, Dave, thank you for setting me up to talk about the REC's guides with the Involvement and Participation Association on how to get the most out of your workforce and engagement. But you're absolutely right. Look, retention is the links between retention and recruitment are absolutely obvious, and that's one of the things we can do for clients, but it's also some thinking that we have to apply to our own businesses, which is, well, how am I selling the vision on what we're doing here? How am I engaging staff? How am I setting things up in ways which encourage people to stay with us for the long haul? And how am I thinking about maybe some of what we do having been in place for 10 or 20 years and needing a change in terms of how we reward people, how we motivate people, so there's some really good stuff progressively coming onto the REC website on that from the work with the IPA. But I think that piece about time spent on it, engagement of your existing staff, is always going to be worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, anecdotally, every one of our clients have struggled to find experienced staff. And it isn't just the experience, we're talking about cultural alignment as well. It's very easy to grab somebody that you think is going to change your world, only to discover that actually they don't fit with the culture of the business. So it's a really hard thing to find people that can supposedly hit the ground running, who are going to be a good fit for the business. And I'd certainly most of our clients, if not all of them now, have come around to the perspective that they need to be bringing in their own people, invest in learning and development, and guide people through the early stages of their career to a position of competence. I think it's the only answer in many respects. To your point about people disappearing into internal recruitment, I agree with you. I think it's a short-lived situation. I don't see that as sustainable. I think that will change in the not too distant future. And I think we may well see some of those people coming back into our industry in the not too distant future too.
I agree with that.
So let's move it on to, there's lots of people sort of thinking about, as we said earlier, we've had record months, record quarters. So as we head into the second part of this year, what advice would you give to recruitment leaders, considering what you've said about the potential slowdown, etc.?
Most simple thing, it's easy to build budgets on hopes. I think we learned in 2020 that contingency matters. So bit of scenario planning, little bit of thinking about contingencies. We don't know that there's going to be a recession. What we do know is the British economy isn't going to grow fast over the next year. So that suggests that just take a pinch of salt with your planning, and make sure that that whatever the kind of if this is the hitting arc, wherever you end up in the hitting arc, the business is okay, and you know what you're going to do. And of course, that will vary massively sector by sector.
I think the thing here, Neil, is that one of the things that every recruitment business has been able to get to grips with over the last few years is that sort of shock that we all went through when we first hit COVID and the lockdown occurred. And it was, as you say, not just a shock, it was a tremor. And people have come out of this, I think, feeling more confident about being agile, being able to be nimble, to move quickly when things change, perhaps to the degree that they perhaps never thought they could approach those issues pre-COVID. So, the people we speak to are not exactly, as you say, they're not confident necessarily about what the next 12 months will bring, because I don't see how anyone can make those predictions comfortably. But I think they're comfortable about the fact that whatever comes in their direction, they can cope with. And that ability to be agile is important. And there's definitely a sense of confidence with the people we work with. To your point, they can see the future, but they're planning over the next 3 months and constantly reviewing and constantly adapting. And I think that's something that wasn't necessarily present before we hit the COVID period.
Yeah, some of that if-then planning. If this happens, then what will I do?
Yeah.
And just being clear in your head as a leader, if this, then that. And I think that's as much as you can do in this environment. There's a real risk that you kind of overcommit to certain things that are path dependent, and then find you don't want to be over there when the world is over there.
True. I think it is about, Annette puts a point up here on the comments, it's about being in control of the things you can control. There are a million one things that are outside of our control right now. In fact, we've discussed them, but it's making sure that we retain control of the things we have influence over, and I think that's the important point here.
I'm glad Annette said that, because the REC staff are sick of me just saying control the controllables. And that's, we control the stuff that we can control, and we'll watch the world outside and react to it. But ultimately, we are of course a third of what we do for the industry is lobbying and campaigning. The result of the Tory leadership election will be what it is, and we'll react to it in the appropriate way. We know what we're about, and we know kind of what we want to say. And I think the same is true in terms of looking at the market.
It's an interesting point that I think Paul's frozen as well. I think his carpet fitter's just cut his wire potentially. One of the comments that's come through from Ryan is why do you think the main reason people are going internal? I've got my own views on that. Why do you think the main people are going internal?
I think there's two bits. One is that some client-side businesses are panicking about not being able to deliver it, and they're throwing cash at internal recruitment, which means that and the different reward structure means that they're being offered very high basics to come into internal. So it's an attractive proposition for some consultants, because it's high base, less kind of contingent income than you'd get on a desk in an agency. And I think that's the primary driver. I think it all the more relevant because, of course, everybody is feeling the impact of inflation on their in their home bills.
And I think I'm the same. I think lots of major companies are struggling and going to lots of recruitment agencies, and they say they can do it themselves. And it's interesting what the next 6 months will bring for those people that they've brought in and whether they can deliver that. Mark Bernard's asked a request more than anything else, Neil. Okay, could the REC promote the use of older candidates to become recruiters? So 50% or more babies were born in 64 than in 77. Let's get 58-year-olds into the branches. Can you help promote that?
So we've done a lot of work with Centre for Aging Better on this. And one of the things we've got to do as an industry is walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So there's something there. Of course, what's really interesting is there's a bit of an industry, the industry that's always been good at that, and that's search.
Yeah,
so
true.
There's
True.
There's a little bit of just taking some of that thinking about search and bringing it into the branches, and I think there's there's definitely more we can do on that. I mean, EDI dominated our conference the week before last in a way that I wasn't expecting it to. I had my ED&I session, but actually it came through everywhere. And that piece around how are we fishing in different pools, yes, for clients, but also for our own businesses, super important. And those networks, and the thing about older workers, and this is where it becomes difficult, is the older workers you want will not want to work a desk in a temp agency the way I worked a desk as a 22-year-old in recruitment. They're going to want to work differently. So that it challenges that thing about how have we always done things.
I do actually think that there's a comment here from Claire saying that they've got somebody starting who's a grandma. Well, I think that's the solution. And speaking as a grandparent, I think that the answer to all our problems is bring in more grandparents. Simple.
So we should all hire Paul.
Okay, I was just going to say exactly the same, Neil. Does that mean on your LinkedIn profile you're going to be open to hiring? I think it's true, because I've got a client as well who's got a person who's well into their 70s who's recruiting very well for them and things like that. So I think it's a marketplace that's absolutely open, and people should look at that grey market and see what it's got from there. So if we haven't got any more questions coming from the board, so any more questions coming from you guys from Jump? If not, I'd just like to say, oh, hang on. Go on, Paul.
Just a quick question, Neil. You said something I think I just wanted to amplify, and I think you said it at the beginning. Let's make sure, and we've been saying this over and over, and it's a mantra, a daily mantra almost by the hour, make sure we are close to our clients. You said it earlier. It's maybe the most urgent and important thing we need to be doing at a point at which we can actually see people. They're back at work. The weather's good. Let's make sure we're very, very close to clients. And I think it's a very important point. I wanted just to underline it. Once we hit that winter period, it's going to be significantly more difficult to get in front of clients. Let's make sure we use the next 3-4 months to embed our relationships and get closer to people who understand what their challenges are going to be. So I just wanted to underline the point you made earlier.
The sun is still shining on us.
Yeah.
Now is the moment to fix the roof.
Thanks, Neil.
Well, Neil, thank you very much as always. It's a great pleasure to have you on. It's a great pleasure to listen to your insight into the marketplace and learn. And I hope everyone that's been on the webinar today has sort of taken some really good things from it. As asked in the session, yes, it is being recorded. It will be on our website by the close of play today at some stage. So if you want to log onto our website, you'll find it on our website. Next week, we are talking about what the SME market can learn from the big players in the market when it comes to using data. So what can you learn from big players to upselling using data? Can you create a better data set from your business? And when it comes to creating prospect to prospect relationships, is data your new band of gold type scenario? So once again, Neil, thank you very much. We're getting lots of praises from people coming through there. James O'Brien, I will obviously get that link sent to you from if the scan's not working for Google reviews. Ladies and gents, let's leave it there. Neil, thank you much once again, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.